Hello, this is Chapter 13, Public Policy. This is the only video for this chapter as well. Some goals of this chapter or this lecture video is to identify public policy and how it affects addiction and treatment. We're going to discuss current public policies and addressing social welfare reforms as well. I did want to take a moment to kind of just point out some things about your textbook in regards to this particular chapter and some things to keep in mind. The authors highlight several current public policies that affect public health and social issues. They also talk about regulating the availability of addictive drugs and how to deal with people who are struggling with addiction. The authors take a position that social context of drug use has helped create our drug problem instead of harm reduction, harm induction. Also, the authors suggest a way that they would address the rapid increase of opiate overdoses in current public policies. And we also plan to address so-called social welfare reforms that impact people with substance problems. So there are definitely some more opinionated views in regards to the authors in this chapter. So I just want to take note of that before we get started. So let's start with welfare reform. Welfare reforms enacted in 1996 related to the war on drugs, and it denied access to cash assistance or food stamps to applicants with recent drug felony convictions. The law did allow for states to ban or modify this reform as they saw fit or as it needed for them. This was difficult for women with children because women had prior drug-related felonies. Also, another reform is TANF, the TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This was also punitive towards women. It required that those receiving this assistance be drug tested in order to continue receiving it. 13 states have actually passed this, or screening of applicants, passing like the drug testing or passing screening of applicants before they receive the temporary assistance. And the last reform that your textbook talks about is in 1997, the removal of coverage for all disabilities that were exclusive to substance use from eligibility from Federal Supplemental Security Income, SSI, and the work requirements associated with TANF, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And this also affected both men and women equally. So those are some of the welfare reforms that happened over the years. Some policies pertaining to the treatment profession. Substance abuse counseling is defined in terms of national laws, local and national fiscal reimbursement policies, and availability of healthcare resources. Legislative mandates provide treatment for certain populations, but not for others, and this shapes the nature of addictions work in terms of clients served as well as services rendered. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind in regards to treatment as a profession itself. Kind of following under that too is we're going to talk about managed care. Managed care, the intended purpose is not to manage care, but it's to manage the cost of the care. So help those who don't have health care options through their employment. However, managed care puts severe limits on mental health services and drug and alcohol services. It placed restrictive policies on inpatient detox programs, limiting financial coverage to outpatient and emphasis on psychiatric medication instead of individual therapy. So there are some downfalls to managed care. Currently, attempts to allow 15 days for inpatient rehab per month for anyone enrolled in a Medicaid managed care plan. Currently, there is a generous proposal for federal funding for treatment for people with substance use disorders. This would emphasize treatment as opposed to punishment for users. Research says that for $1 of treatment, it saves at least $11 in healthcare and criminal justice costs. A national survey shows that 2/3 of people favor treatment over prison. So that's something interesting. So if we promote more treatment, we'll reduce the costs in other areas such as healthcare or prison. In a previous edition of this textbook, private for-profit treatment centers were closing their doors due to the demand for services for people with co-occurring disorders were not being met. With new expectations of the Affordable Care Act, this may be able to be reversed. Newer treatment models emphasize case management and networking, so that is helpful. The mental health courts are designed to help people with mental illness who get into trouble. With this new law, they're staying out of jail. So mental health courts are not designed to put people in jail, they're designed to keep people out of jail. So they're specifically working with people who struggle with mental illness and commit a crime. Addiction therapists must be versatile and knowledgeable about mental disorders as well as popular drugs of misuse. Must be able to work with dual diagnosis patients because let's face it, it's out there. We got both. The law and ethical codes. Confidentiality of alcohol and drug abuse patient records 42 CFR Part 2 was adopted in the 1970s, but it was revised again in 1987. This is a very strict confidentiality law, and it says that no disclosure to any party, including medical personnel, without the client's consent, and only exception is in regards to child abuse or life-threatening to self or to others. So unless you suspect child abuse or they're threatening to harm themselves or somebody else, you cannot tell anybody anything unless there is a signed consent form. Involuntary commitments are sending people for their own good to jail or like a facility like jail for treatment. It's usually for people that are at risk for harming themselves or someone else. So that might be something more like your mental health state hospital or something. I wanted to bring up a case that your textbook talks about, Kerr versus Ferry in 1996. This occurred in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Wisconsin. The First Amendment rights were violated of Kerr because he was coerced into attending an NA program. If he didn't attend, then he would have been transferred into a medium security prison. The NA program was ruled to be religious, not secular. Therefore, Kerr had a right to refuse treatment. This could be an issue faced by those working in addiction treatment. So I wanted to take note of that because I don't necessarily like to put some of those case studies on quizzes, but I put this one on there in particular because it's talking about whether or not a First Amendment right was violated. So definitely pay attention to that, and that may be on a quiz. Most professions have ethical codes of conduct. For substance abuse, each state actually has its own code of ethics. Typical provisions are practicing non-discriminatory behaviors with clients on the basis of race, color, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, etc. Continuing professional and educational growth, and not exploiting clients sexually or financially. Agreeing to report professional misconduct of colleagues, such as violation of client confidentiality, and you cannot have a dual relationship with your clients, which would be sharing a relationship outside of the professional relationship. So that is kind of like a very standard across the board code of ethics. The war on drugs. We have talked about this before, and you've probably heard of it before. So over the years, I wanted to kind of point out some things that are important to be aware of with the war on drugs. In 1999, the then drug czar, General Barry McCaffrey, stated that we have a failed social policy and it has to be reevaluated. It changed again in 2007. The United States Conference of Mayors adopted a resolution stating that due to the failure of the drug war, they were calling for a harm reduction-oriented approach to drug policy. And latest in 2015, Michael Botticelli, the White House Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or drug czar, stated that the old war on drugs was all wrong. We can't arrest and incarcerate addiction out of people. That's something interesting to kind of note on the war on drugs. Recent opinion polls showed that 87% agree with the statement that we are losing the war on drugs. 58% of people favored the legalization of marijuana, the legalization of marijuana. In 1969, there was only 12% that agreed with the legalization of marijuana. So that has significantly increased since then. The U.S. government has spent $173 billion fighting the war against competing cartels. 55% of the annual budget is devoted to policies that attempt to reduce the supply of drugs. So what is this war on drugs? It started 2 decades ago with Ronald Reagan. President Nixon, however, was the first to use the term. The focus is on the supply side of the drugs more than on the demand. So they were focusing on supply, not demand. President Bush, strict sentencing laws were passed, mandatory minimum sentences, and the criminalization of drugs. the presumption that abstinence is the only right relationship to those drugs, support for the strategy of international interdiction practices, examples, eradicating poppy fields and increasing border surveillance to diminish the supply of drugs in the United States, and using various practices of enforcement such as drug testing, wiretapping, and forfeiture of property. So that's kind of a little bit on the war on drugs. In 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that minimum sentences should not be mandatory but merely advisory. Also, guidelines were set for federal prison sentencing voted to lighten punishments retroactively for inmates who were serving sentences for crack cocaine. With the sentences for crack cocaine, we have that Fair Sentencing Act that came in 2010 with President Obama, where the laws reduced the 100-to-1 ratio to 18-to-1 ratio. So that's where that came in. I know we mentioned that before, but I wanted to bring that up in the policy section as well. Continuing on with mandatory sentencing, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 15% of all sentenced prisoners under state jurisdiction were convicted involving illegal drugs, in relation to different races, cultures, and genders being represented in the system. African Americans are underrepresented in the rates of drug offenders placed on probation instead of sentenced to serve prison terms. So keep in mind, African Americans are underrepresented in those rates. Of the 15% mentioned above that are sentenced prisoners, 32.6% were white, 38.4% were African American, and 19.2% were Latino. That's out of that 15% population. The imprisonment rates for women expanded greatly as a result of their involvement with a male partner. Conviction for African American females was extremely high when crack cocaine was popular, and currently conviction of white women is increasing due to meth and heroin addiction problems. Moving on to something else that was kind of related to the war on drugs, which was civil asset forfeitures. Law enforcement can take the money and property of persons involved in a drug crime without the owners being convicted, indicted, or even arrested for a particular crime. So that's something, to keep in mind. They can take what they want. Police can seize property under civil asset forfeiture laws. This can include cars, boats that get auctioned off, and raised money goes to that particular police department. An owner can challenge a seizure by arguing that he or she did not know his property was being used for criminal purposes, but of course that has to be proven. The Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act of 2000 was designed to make things better, but it actually made things worse. It expanded government forfeiture laws to include approximately 200 felonies and violations, making more property subject to government forfeiture even after the statute of limitations had passed for criminal prosecution. Under this law, informants are awarded 25 to 50% of the value of the seized property. That is interesting as well. As of 2015, only 7 states and Washington, D.C. had improved the civil forfeiture laws to shift from the burden of proof to prosecution. 2 states have abolished civil forfeiture altogether. And another interesting fact is that the profit incentive creates a conflict of interest in law enforcement. Nationwide, more than 500 police departments have seized the equivalent of 20% or more of their yearly budgets. So definitely some interesting statistics and facts when we talk about civil asset forfeiture. Drug-free zones. You may have heard of these before. The practice of those drug-free zones were designed to protect children from drug trafficking by creating safe places, where children could gather. And the penalties for drug offenses that occurred within these specifically named out drug-free zones would be increased dramatically. In 1984, an amended version of the 1970 Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act provided federal penalties of twice the maximum punishment for drug offenses committed within 1,000 feet of a school, college, or playground, and within 100 feet of a youth center, swimming pool, or video arcade. By 2000, every state had adopted some version of the drug-free zone law, and there was a question of whether this law was actually fair and was it actually protecting children, or what was the purpose of it. A little blurb on the punishment of pregnant drug users in regards to these social policies. Since the 1970s, there have been almost 800 arrests or forced interventions of women for using substances thought to cause severe developmental delays to their unborn child when substances were consumed during pregnancy. 15 states treat prenatal drug use as a child abuse, and 3 explicitly allow mothers to be criminally prosecuted. 2001, the United States Supreme Court case Ferguson versus City of Charleston, the court ruled that performing a diagnostic test on a pregnant mother for the purpose of criminal investigation without her consent is an unreasonable search and is thus unconstitutional. Despite this ruling, women are still being prosecuted in some states. Drug use during pregnancy can be considered child abuse or neglect and can result in the removal of the child when it is born. So some things to kind of keep in mind with pregnant women. We did talk a lot about women and the differences in treatment for addiction for them. There have been some policies in the systems of payment and insurance coverage. 2010 passage of health reform means that millions more Americans now have insurance coverage for addiction and mental health care treatment as a part of their basic benefit package. So that was a positive. The Affordable Care Act now provides access to prevention programming, early intervention, and treatment of mental and substance use disorders. I mentioned back when we were talking about the levels of care that a lot of times 0.5 early intervention was not considered covered under insurance companies. So it's slowly starting to get there under the Affordable Care Act. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a report about professionals in the addiction field. It said that there were high staff turnover rates, it was an aging workforce, and inadequate pay to maintain these professional workers in this field. Despite the issues with professionals, more and more people are becoming eligible for treatment, so we're going to need more and more professionals to help work with them. So, something to kind of keep in mind with those high turnover rates and inadequate pay. Harm reduction. We talked a lot about harm reduction throughout this course. Just some points to point out with policy in regards to harm reduction. The National Association of Social Workers, NASW, in its policy statement handbook endorses harm reduction approaches and alternatives to incarceration. Macro policy level would be needle exchange programs to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. 20 to 34% of people who have contracted HIV/AIDS or Hep C have gotten it through sharing contaminated needles. As a result, we've already kind of clarified that we've seen a decline in disease from, with these needle exchange programs. The World Health Organization, WHO, have endorsed the use of methadone and buprenorphine, Suboxone as preferred treatments because of their proven effectiveness over detoxification. So that's something also harm reduction related that policy has been, put towards with that. So the other thing that we talk about in this particular chapter is legalization of marijuana. And that's kind of something we'll close out this chapter with. So there are some steps towards the legalization of marijuana, and this has obviously been a big controversy for years now, so we always want to talk about it and address it in this addictions course. To legalize, it is treating a substance like marijuana, which is the same as tobacco, meaning it would be regulated, taxed, and marketed. Decriminalizing something like marijuana is allowing people to use the drug without any penalties being imposed, but the drug would not be sold at grocery stores or other public areas. Portugal decriminalized the personal use of all drugs, including heroin and cocaine. Drug possession was still illegal, and users of the drugs could still be stopped by the police, have the drugs confiscated, and be sent to appear before a commission to be questioned, but there were no punishments. Researchers found that there were positive results with decriminalization. Drug trafficking and other crimes were significantly reduced, as were deaths from overdose, by just decriminalizing. It has this belief that removing fears of prosecution, the policy has encouraged people who desire it to enter into treatment. So that's something interesting with decriminalizing versus legalizing. Two types of legalization of marijuana. One is for medical marijuana and the other is for recreational use. Speaking on medical marijuana first, we need to mention that the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration has classified marijuana with heroin and LSD as a Schedule I drug, meaning that it has a high potential for abuse and no legitimate therapeutic uses. Therefore, there are limited studies of the benefits. The U.S. uses marijuana to reduce pain caused by damaged nerves in HIV patients. It also increases appetite and reduces nausea. Therefore, it stimulates the appetites for HIV patients and cancer patients receiving chemotherapy. It also is proven to help those with MS in form of pills or oral sprays to reduce stiffness and muscle spasms. It can also help control seizures for those who have epilepsy. So those are the medical uses that the United States has kind of ruled. 2016, there is no longer a federal ban on medical marijuana. 23 states and Washington, D.C. allow for such usage through state laws differ in terms of illness for which the drug can be used. Some common policy questions regarding medical marijuana regulation and distribution. There tends to be patient registry, and it helps to provide some protection against arrest for possession up to a certain amount of medical use for marijuana or medicinal uses. Let's talk a little bit about recreational marijuana. 2016, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. have legalized the sales of marijuana, while initiatives are pending in at least 20 other states. Most of the pro-recreation use states are for the money to be made in the business of it. According to Businessweek, the U.S. sales of legal cannabis reached $5.4 billion in 2015. States like Colorado are thriving financially through the collection of tax revenues and tourist trade. There are some cons, though, to legalizing marijuana. We got to put those out there. Marijuana could be a gateway drug. I used to not agree with that term. I mean, I feel that anything could really be a gateway drug, but if we legalize marijuana, like we legalize alcohol and tobacco, like is it setting someone up to start using other substances? That's always a question that's kind of proposed out there. So your textbook has identified that as a con to legalizing marijuana. Young people who are genetically susceptible to developing schizophrenia are more apt to develop mental health problems with heavy drug use. Heavy marijuana smoking among youth is associated with brain abnormalities, memory problems, and motivational issues. The popularity of marijuana in edible form carries the risk of people consuming more than what their bodies can handle. Legalization will increase the availability of this drug. The potency of marijuana has increased since the 1970s, so early research showing few health risks may be misleading at this point in time. Despite the fact that this drug is generally considered to be a non-addicting, it is estimated that around 9% of users will lose control of their craving and become addicted. Legalization will lead to an economic incentive to get users of this product to consume large quantities, a fact that is true of marketing any other drug that enhances pleasure. So the authors also have some pros to the legalization of marijuana, and this is specifically based off of their beliefs. Again, I think that this, out of all the chapters of the textbook, this might be the most biased or most opinionated the authors have been. Their pros are due to health and behavioral risks associated with intoxicating drug regulation of its distribution is warranted. This can be done through legalization. Removal of marijuana from the Schedule I category will enable scientists to study more of the health benefits as well as risks of long-term exposure. Legalization will reduce the crime rate that is associated with black market sales that accompany prohibition of a substance. Sales and marketing of tobacco and alcohol are strictly regulated. The same can be done with marijuana. Incarceration rates associated with the war on drugs will be reduced considerably. Family life, especially of minority groups hard hit by the war on drugs, will be restored. Legalization will increase jobs and help restore prosperity to the states which can successfully produce and sell the crop. Tax revenues will be greatly expanded. Appalachian regions can now grow hemp, which has many uses and will boost the economy of the eastern mountain states. Through legalization and regulation, the potency of the marijuana will be carefully controlled. With marijuana readily available in shops, people who wish to get high will be less inclined to use harder drugs. Practitioners who subscribe to harm reduction model can now more easily suggest clients addicted to harder drugs to switch to marijuana. So those are, some of the pros and cons to the legalization of marijuana. Some treatment developments that your book has mentioned kind of at the end there is an interesting finding is that CASA, the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University, put out a report on state spending that considered all costs of substance use and addiction in 16 budget categories and found that every dollar the state spends on dealing with substance use and addiction, 96 cents went to shoveling up the wreckage, meaning already addicted people, and aftermath type stuff, and 4 cents to prevent and treat it. The focus has since shifted towards prevention and early intervention in primary care offices. And last but not least, social policy change is slowly progressing to the federal level. Most are geared to the provision of treatment in lieu of carceration of drug misusers. For example, the introduction of specialized courts such as drug and mental health courts. So we are definitely seeing some positive steps towards harm reduction. It's just a matter of getting there. All progress is slow. So that is a little bit of insight on some of the public policies that your textbook covers. And that is the end of chapter 13. So thank you for watching.